Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone for coming today and attending my presentation. I'm here in Europe. I'm a visiting scholar at the moment at the Brussels Privacy Hub in the lead up to CPDP, the Computers, Privacy and Data Protection Conference. I'm originally based in Queensland, Australia, in Brisbane at the Queensland University of Technology. So I'm coming at this from a very much a policy and a socio-legal perspective. I'm not a cryptographer, I'm not a technical person, I'm a criminologist by trade. My main research interests lie at the intersections of technology and policing specifically, and my presentation will very much touch upon both of these areas. I think it's a really good case study about this intersection. I first became very much interested in this area, or this topic, mostly through my own civil society work in terms of campaigning against this law that was very recently introduced in Australia. So the title of my talk, as you can see, Ask Access but Not a Backdoor, the Five Eyes, hashtag War en Masse. I know there are a lot of anal puns in that, but I will kind of explain them and hopefully they'll become clear throughout my presentation. So the plan is I'm going to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes and then we're going to have some questions and audience discussion at the end, and I'd be really interested to get your feedback on this, particularly from the more technical perspective. So I wanted to thank also CEDA for inviting me here, kind of very serendipitously in my short time here in Belgium, and also everyone here at COSIC for having me also. Before I get started, I just wanted to acknowledge my co-authors. This is a collaborative piece of work. I'm working on it with two other scholars. First of all, Dr. Angela Daly, who is a legal scholar based at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and also Dr. Adam Molnar, who is also a criminologist, who's at Deakin University, but currently based at the Citizen Lab in Canada. So together, we've been charting some of the policy mobilities of encryption breaking technologies in the second crypto war, essentially post-Snowden. I refer to this as Crypto War 2.0 because there is a longer history of the crypto wars, which I'll also touch upon. And I'm going to focus very much specifically on the Five Eyes Alliance, which has very much been leading these developments, so to say. We plan to submit this work to the Open Access Journal Internet Policy Review in the coming months, so it is a really good opportunity for me to be here and present it and get your feedback. In terms of my presentation today, this is just a kind of general roadmap or an outline. I'm going to provide some background and context on the hashtag War en Masse, specifically in Australia, including an overview of the passage of the law, which is the Telecommunications and Other Legislation Amendment Assistance and Access Act. I'm then going to touch upon very briefly end-to-end encryption and some variations from more of a kind of a legal perspective, not so much the technical or cryptographic perspective that will be familiar to you, but just in terms of what they've really attempted to do through law, in terms of mandating access and so forth. I'm then going to discuss a bit of the history of the crypto wars with a focus again on Five Eyes and also within the post-Snowden period. I'm then going to discuss the Ask Access Act, and I'm going to highlight and really speak to the new powers and obligations that it introduces. And this very much, I think, raises a very important question, an almost existential question about what actually constitutes a backdoor or a systemic weakness, and I think that this is where the intersections of law and technology really come to the fore. In terms of some of my real research interests, these relate to transnational online information flows. So I'm also going to touch upon some of the extraterritorial implications of this law. It extends extraterritorially in a number of ways, and I think that they're really interesting, so I'm going to discuss those. Outline some of the issues and concerns that I have, and then kind of conclude, well, so what? So what can we do, and so what will be kind of happening moving forward? In terms of background and why it's known as the hashtag War en Masse, and just in terms of the general overview of the introduction of this new law, and I see a couple of you giggling, this is a bit kind of ridiculous and quite embarrassing from my perspective, but this was our former Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull. He made this kind of very Orwellian statement.
It's good to know Windows is not genuine.
Windows is not genuine. There's a backdoor in your software. He made this very kind of Orwellian statement in relation to the laws of mathematics, and he made this in kind of mid-2017, specifically in relation to the going dark problem and law enforcement and intelligence agencies' attempts to access encrypted communication. And he stated, and I quote, "The laws of mathematics are very commendable, but the only law that applies in Australia is the law of Australia." So this is very ridiculous, kind of hilarious, particularly for people who have some understanding of mathematics. But from this point, and at least in the Australian context, what I'm going to talk to today is very much known as became known as the war on maths, and again, particularly on Twitter, we were kind of organising around this, so it became hashtag war on maths, and then later hashtag AA bill when the bill was introduced. So when Turnbull made this statement, it was really kind of when we started working on this project. And again, from this kind of civil society or more of an activist perspective. And we wanted to look to other, and in particular Five Eyes jurisdictions, to kind of anticipate, well, what is this going to look like? You know, he says the laws of mathematics, you know, don't apply in Australia, only the law of Australia applies, but how is this going to actually work? So we charted and looked at other Five Eyes countries to kind of get a sense of really, well, what can we anticipate to kind of very much gear up our campaign to understand, well, what are we fighting or what are we going to be up against? So in terms of the timeline from when Turnbull first made this statement, mid-2017, and within an 18-month period from this statement, the Arse Access Act was introduced as law, and that happened in December, just before I left to come here to Europe. So it was quite a long-awaited, I guess, law. We knew it was coming, but we didn't see a draft or any written proposals about what they were planning to do or what they were going to do until August of last year. So it was over a year later we actually saw the first draft of it. And this is when the Department of Home Affairs, they released an exposure draft, and we were essentially given just over 2 weeks to comment on it. And just worth noting, it was you know, over 200 pages, almost 200 pages long. It amends every piece of surveillance legislation in Australia. So it was a really crazy time in terms of trying to pull together and actually get some kind of sensible comments back to government in the process of drafting it. So what we did, you know, many hands makes less work. We tried to pull together a wider civil society coalition. And I also should have mentioned that I'm also on the board of directors of the Australian Privacy Foundation. So as part of this, you know, we pulled together this coalition across all of the digital rights organisations and also civil liberties organisations in Australia, and we provided, you know, very detailed comments and recommendations. The first one being "do not proceed," but this was also followed up with more specific recommendations to improve the proposal. Essentially then what happened 10 days after that deadline, the bill was introduced into our lower House of Parliament, completely ignoring recommendations made. So we kind of saw, well, this is, you know, this is where it's going. They're not really interested in consulting with experts, they're not really interested in consulting with civil society. This is very much a faux process of consultation. So once it was introduced to our lower House of Parliament, it was referred to a parliamentary joint committee, specifically on intelligence and security, for review, and we then made a subsequent submission to this also. And all of our submissions on this topic are available, you know, very readily online with a quick Google search. So it should also be kind of noted that this, in this time frame, there was also a leadership spill within our federal government, within our Prime Ministers kept changing in kind of quick succession, and we now have a new Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, and he's approaching an election campaign or an election year this year in Australia, and he's very much running on a national security platform, so you can see where this is going. And just as an aside, you know, Scott Morrison is the guy who credits, you know, he draws credit for being the one who stopped the boats and you know, has great involvement in our very inhumane system of offshore detention of refugees. So I guess that there's a much more kind of tough on crime, tough on law and order, tough on national security kind of platform, particularly through the lens of border control, border security and terrorism. So once Scott Morrison was in power, he very much rammed the bill through both houses of Parliament. He publicly taunted the opposition if they didn't support passage of the bill. They were soft on terrorists. They were soft on pedophiles and those distributing child exploitation material on the internet, for example. These are the kind of arguments that were being made at that time. The Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security handed down a very watered down approach, again ignoring all recommendations, and it was introduced as law on the last sitting day of Parliament last year in December. So that's basically the background and introduction to the Access Act. It's really only a few weeks old, so in terms of being in force. So it's good that I get to come and kind of travel around Europe and tell everyone about it, because there are indeed global implications, particularly for those working or developing software and also hardware. So before I delve kind of further into our analysis, I'm just going to touch upon some aspects of end-to-end encryption that I consider relevant, and the history of the first crypto wars. But I'm assuming that you all know way more about this than I do, so I'm not going to dwell on it or make a fool of myself by going into kind of territory, more technical territory. And I can't seem to go forward.
Oh
No.
no. No?
Yes, perfect. So you guys, you all know about this, yeah? Alice to Bob, to prevent eavesdropping from Eve, or in this context perhaps the NSA. So yes, I'm not a cryptographer, but I've very much tried my hardest to understand some of the technical dimensions to end-to-end encryption. But yeah, given the audience today, I'm not going to focus too much on this. Essentially, from my understanding, is that this is a very complicated, a very complex system of mathematics and cryptographic algorithms that allow for any person, in this case Alice, to encrypt a message into ciphertext and send it to Bob using his public key, so the message cannot be read and can be securely sent from A to B. So that encrypted message can only be decrypted from ciphertext and back into readable plaintext with the receiver's private key, and thus is safe from eavesdropping by Eve or the NSA. So my point in all of this is that law enforcement don't like it. They don't like it for very obvious reasons. In the Australian context, but this is arguments that are made kind of internationally, we see internationally, and very, quite consistently. Law enforcement and intelligence agencies, already argue that encryption impacts 90% of their priority cases. In Australia, the Department of Home Affairs has estimated that all communications between terrorists and organised criminals, or indeed perhaps also activists, are probably already encrypted, but will be definitely encrypted within the next 2 years. And so this is very much what's known as the going dark problem, and this is why we see these attempts to kind of undermine encryption. So in terms of variations of encryption, and I know that this is very different from a technical sense, but in terms of telecommunications and service providers and the various different ways that law has tried to regulate encryption, these are kind of the 4 variations that I think is important to just outline before I go into sort of the legal attempts that we've seen are being made. So in terms of these 4 types of encryption, I just highlight them along the lines of the degree of involvement or control by the service provider in terms of whether or not they maintain the cryptographic key or whether or not they can decode or intercept the messages. Some measures introduced, particularly in the United Kingdom and also in New Zealand, have involved mandating or compelling decryption that is applied by or on behalf of a service provider. So in which case they would have to comply in cases 1 and 2, but in scenarios 3 and 4 it would not be technically feasible to do so because of the laws of mathematics. Again, another point that I just wanted to raise, because it becomes important when we start thinking about this through kind of some of the laws or a legal lens in terms of what has been introduced. It's important to emphasise, and you probably already know this, but information needs to be decrypted at the ends, so Bob can actually read Alice's message. He can actually read the plain text of what she's sending him. But then, of course, this means if a device at the ends is compromised, law enforcement and intelligence agencies can also access the plain text. And this is a point that I'm going to return to in terms of lawful hacking or government hacking, because we also see this as kind of one of the kind of complementary strategies that they're using and moving forward with this type of access. So in terms of history of the crypto wars, attempts to undermine encryption are not new. Certainly they've been ongoing for the past 3 decades. I don't know if you know the academic Bert-Jaap Coops. He's at Tilburg, at the Tilburg Institute of Law, Tech and Society. He did his PhD, actually very much focused on a Dutch perspective on the first crypto wars. That's, I guess, a really helpful resource if you're interested in this area in terms of the longer history. So I guess the most famous example is back in the 1990s is the Clipper chip. Are we all aware of this? Some of us, yes, not all. Well, the NSA tried to promote what is known as the Clipper chip. That's it on the slide there. It's an encryption device that secured voice and data, but it had a built-in backdoor, so the NSA could also access all communications. And this was essentially, I think it was via key escrow. This wasn't taken up very widely at the time, and I guess, I wonder why people weren't very comfortable with having kind of the NSA access in their communications. But this is significant because this kind of was leading up to and spurred the cypherpunk movement. Again, are we aware of this? The cypherpunks and the development of PGP encryption, pretty good privacy, again, freely available, not under control of government. And that has really formed the target of attacks on encryption today, or what we're calling the crypto war 2.0. And particularly in Five Eyes countries, and particularly around this kind of problem that law enforcement intelligence agencies are saying that they have in relation to going dark. I think it's also kind of important to note Five Eyes were also the ones very much implicated by the Snowden revelations in 2013, now 6 years ago. And we also saw those very same revelations kind of spurring a kind of much wider take-up of end-to-end encryption as very much a last line of defence against this type of kind of surveillance by the Five Eyes partners. In terms of some of the more recent work done on this topic, Coops and Costa just last year put out a paper and they argued, and I tend to agree with them about this, is that there's unlikely to be a crypto war 3.0, and this is because of developments in legal hacking or lawful hacking, also known as, in Australia and UK, it's tend to be kind of referred to as computer network operations, and in the US, network investigative techniques. And this is really an expansion in law enforcement's ability and attempts to access or gain access to endpoints when information is not encrypted. And I'm going to discuss this also further as it relates very much to some of the developments we've seen in the Australian context. All right. So just quickly to touch upon, there are a range of different approaches that we've already seen to kind of undermining encryption, both technically and also in law and policy. I've listed these on the slide. Each of these comes with some of their own limits, unintended consequences, and also possibilities for circumvention. The introduction of encryption backdoors, or mandating the deliberate introduction of systemic vulnerabilities, is but one approach. And it's just one approach that's being proposed to address this going dark problem, but it's probably the most controversial, I would say. And that's why we tend to see a lot of public debate around this issue in particular. And this is because it has a real potential for impacts at network level in terms of undermining information security kind of more widely. Particularly because if law enforcement can access information via a backdoor, so can other more nefarious actors. For example, hackers, foreign state spies, and so forth. So if you open the back door for kind of one party, you won't open it for a whole bunch of others, which I think is also very significant in the context of all of these Russian hackers and misinformation and so forth. All right, so I'm assuming we all know about Five Eye, the Five Eyes Alliance. It's a very comprehensive intelligence alliance between Western Anglophone countries. It operates essentially to circumvent domestic limits on spying on own citizens by spying on each other's citizens and then sharing the information with one another. The extent of Five Eyes surveillance was again very much revealed by Snowden in 2013. Again, that was 6 years ago, and I'm not really sure. I mean, we can only really guess what they're up to now. I also just wanted to emphasise that in each of the Five Eyes countries, there's a different legal or constitutional framework. They have different framework in terms of their fundamental rights. And this very much significantly impacts what they can do or what can be introduced at a local level. So, for example, in the US, there are limits in terms of the Fifth Amendment to the US Constitution. Also, similar kind of provisions apply in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, specifically in relation to protections against self-incrimination, but also First Amendment protections as well. And there are judicial rulings that have kind of upheld that cryptographic code is a form of free speech, for example. So we need to keep these domestic conditions in each of the Five Eyes in mind when we start to think about this kind of problem from a legal perspective. There have been historical developments in the US and Canada. For example, in 1994, the US introduced the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act. This has some very similar provisions as what we're starting to see being introduced as part of Crypto War 2.0. But in our analysis, we've specifically focused on the developments post-Snowden, because this is where we really saw this debate about encryption and mandating encryption backdoors really kind of back on the agenda of the Five Eyes. So we trace the approaches in the UK, New Zealand and also Australia, as these countries have all very recently introduced laws post-Snowden that have attempted to compel decryption and possibly even the introduction of encryption backdoors. But that is a very contentious issue, and I'm going to come back and discuss it further also. So in terms of, I guess being kind of a socio-legal researcher, a social scientist, we tend to approach our research and analysis through kind of theoretical policy frameworks. And we approach this through the framework or through the lens of policy, mobilities, assemblages and mutations. This is a more nuanced approach than just thinking about this specifically in terms of policy transfer within the field of critical policy analysis. And this is because it takes into consideration the transnational reverberation of policies as they circulate across jurisdictions, and also with regard to, as I outlined, the unique domestic contexts in each of these jurisdictions. So we looked at the convergence of Five Eyes policies, their formation and their adoption, specifically around the meeting of Five Eyes partners and their issuances of joint communiques. And these very much related to strategies such as cooperation with tech companies is a big one, and I'm going to continue to come back to that, while also cross-referencing each other's Five Eyes members' policy. They issued communiques emphasising mutual responsibility, especially concerning cooperation with tech companies, freedom of choice for lawful access solutions, and the creation of customised solutions to access information in local telecommunications architectures, but I would also emphasise in local kind of legal fundamental rights and constitutional frameworks also. I just want to also note that, of course, non-legislative cooperation is occurring between the Five Eyes as well, and also between government agencies and telecommunications providers. So our focus on law and policy is but one dimension, and there's kind of a much kind of wider ecosystem happening here. We focus on Australia, not just because I'm from there, although that is certainly helpful, but given the recent developments with the Arts Access Act. And primarily because of the very unique domestic context of Australia. Not very many people know this even within Australia actually, but we are the only Western democracy that does not have any comprehensive or enforceable human rights protections at a federal level, and that's very significant in terms of what the government can do. We also have a very aggressive stance, in particular in terms of legislating on issues of national security, which has indeed been termed a hyper-legislative approach. I also think there's significant potential, and I'm going to demonstrate some of the ways in which this occurs or this applies in this context, for jurisdiction shopping among Five Eyes. And this should be considered in the context of the already well-known kind of regulatory arbitrage, where information is lawfully intercepted in one country, in one of the Five Eyes members' country that has weaker human rights protections, to circumvent domestic limits on spying on one's own citizens, and then transferred and used in other Five Eyes members countries that have more restrictive human rights frameworks. And again, very much Edward Snowden's revelations were kind of really at the heart of this. So I'm just going to run through the legal approaches in New Zealand and the UK on this issue, kind of showing how it has informed but also differs from what has actually been introduced in the Australian jurisdiction in terms of background. So in New Zealand, in very quick succession, really the same year as soon as it happened, to the Snowden revelations, the Telecommunications Interception Capability and Security Act was introduced. So this requires network operators to ensure that their networks can be technically subject to lawful interception. So in practice, this means that there are some questions about whether or not an operator or telecommunications provider can provide true end-to-end encryption on its services and still be able to comply in the event that they are issued with a lawful request. So, as I outlined at the start, if it was a truly end-to-end encrypted service, this would not be possible. It would not be technically possible to intercept the plain text of communications under this kind of approach. In the New Zealand context, this is kind of more of a theoretical question, however, because at present most of New Zealand's service providers are offshore and this law does not apply to them extraterritorially, so there's no way to actually enforce it. So you have to also kind of consider this in kind of the broader context about how one would enforce laws elsewhere. Indeed, now we move to the UK. It's a very interesting time for me to be in Brussels. Not so much because of Brexit, but here our focus is on the Investigatory Powers Act, also known as the Snoopers Charter. Again, a very complicated piece of surveillance legislation, but I focus specifically on the provisions around encryption. This is kind of modelled on the New Zealand approach. It provides for what is known as technical capability notices that allow for the UK government to order telecommunications providers to remove any form of electronic protection applied by or on behalf of an operator. So it's very similar to what we're seeing in New Zealand. So this, again, is not necessarily kind of a true backdoor, but we question, I guess, what they're trying to do here is introduce like a policy backdoor, in that operators cannot provide true end-to-end encryption in the first instance, so they will have to be able to comply in the event they're issued with a lawful notice to enable access. Again, this only pertains to encryption that the providers have applied themselves, and I think that's kind of really key and shows the importance of freely available open source cryptography. And then enter the Arse Access Act. This is a very complicated, a very complex and convoluted piece of legislation. It amends every existing piece of surveillance legislation in Australia at the federal level. It also introduces new obligations for telecommunications providers or designated communications providers, very broadly defined, and I'm going to come back and talk about some of the broad definitions because I believe they'll probably impact people in this room. It's essentially anyone hosting a website, anyone writing software or designing hardware that is provided in Australia to implement these kind of new measures. I would argue that it very much redefines the future of government interception of electronic communications in Australia and possibly even further afield, because it does apply extraterritorially, and I'm going to outline the various ways in which it does so. It attempts to regulate offshore, designated communications providers offshore, that is outside of the Australian sovereign state. How this will occur in practice is also a bit of an unresolved question, and it also relates to the enforcement of foreign laws, and that's a point that I'm going to come back to because it's quite significant in the context of requests being funneled through Australia from other Five Eyes partners. So under Schedule 1 of the Arse Access Act, technical assistance requests, technical assistance notices and technical capability notices are introduced. As you see here, the language has very much been inspired by the kind of the New Zealand approach and also the UK approach, But the specific strategy differs quite significantly, and I'll outline each of these types of notices or requests in detail soon. Under Schedule 2, I don't have a lot of time to go into this in great depth, but it's also very important because it amends and enhances existing powers that law enforcement and intelligence agencies already have around covert computer access warrants that enable law enforcement to access evidence or information at endpoints when it's not encrypted. It also strengthens existing search and seizure powers, and it also makes amendments to our Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Act, which also has some extraterritorial implications. All right, can you read that? Not really. It's copied. It's essentially the text from the Act, but I will speak to it and explain what it means. So this is the Schedule 1 edition of a technical assistance request. It allows for government to request a provider to do an unlimited range of acts or things, is the language that they're using, and I'll also describe what some of those acts and things are. And it's framed in a voluntary sense, so it's a kind of a carrot as opposed to a stick. There are no civil or criminal penalties for non-compliance, but they are also still covered by secrecy provisions in terms of unauthorised disclosure about what's going on. I should also note that these kind of technical assistance requests and also the technical assistance notices are not authorised by a judge or a judicial officer, but rather executive positions and the heads of interception agencies. So i.e. law enforcement and intelligence agencies themselves, self-authorising kind of the administration of these powers, which is really concerning from kind of a separation of powers perspective and an oversight perspective, I would argue. So I don't know if any of you know the work of Chris Culnane. He is a cryptographer at Melbourne Uni, and I've been talking about this issue with him quite a lot, and he put out a blog post which was quite informative on these kind of issues in particular, the technical assistance requests. And he cautioned that the technical assistance requests are actually the real objective of the legislation, and not the notices, which I'll go on to discuss next. And he argues that this is because there are few, if indeed any, limitations on what government or interceptions agencies can request, and they are also excluded from any of the already limited oversight and reporting measures, such as annual reports by the Minister. So perhaps most significantly, unlike compulsory notices that are introduced under this law, there is no restriction on a technical assistance request asking for the implementation of a systemic weakness or a backdoor. So they have some constraints on the introduction of backdoors, and these are set forth in the Division 7 limitations, but they do not apply to technical assistance requests. And I'm going to come back and discuss those constraints when we reach the existential question of what actually constitutes an encryption backdoor or a systemic weakness. Look, I'd probably go a bit further than Chris, and I would argue what we're very much seeing here is quite reminiscent of what was revealed by Snowden in terms of the PRISM program, which was a very much hand-in-glove arrangement between government and the major tech companies, essentially enabling them to tap into the back end of their systems and data slurp. And I think, you know, we should be also mindful that Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Apple, etc. were kind of okay with this while it was not known publicly. And so I think considering that this is again being framed as a request, there are very few limits on disclosure, and they're also covered by secrecy provisions. We should also kind of cast our minds back to what we know has already gone on before. So then the technical assistance requests then kind of escalate, it moves to the stick, and these become technical assistance notices. So they're essentially the same, but they compel a provider to do an unlimited range of acts or things. And these, again, Chris Culnane also argues here that they're designed to gain access to existing capabilities that a communication provider may have already to access information. They must be complied with. They have civil penalties if you don't, up to 10 million Australian dollars for companies and $50,000 for individuals for non-cooperation. So this, I don't think is really comparable in terms of 4% of annual global turnover under the GDPR, for example. But it might be quite significant for local startups and also for local developers or people who are working and developing these kinds of systems. And I also think there's a question here around extraterritorial enforcement of tech companies, so for example Google or Facebook, where these amounts are likely to be kind of a drop in the ocean for them given their already kind of extensive global annual turnover. Again, I have questions about how this enforcement or the extraterritorial enforcement of these laws will occur in practice and indeed extraterritorially from outside the Australian state. 10 million Australian dollars is about €6 million. Again, it's a drop in the ocean for Facebook, especially when they can just ignore the fines or kind of move their offices offshore, for example. So that kind of covers the technical assistance requests and the notices. And so these are, as I've just kind of reiterated, around existing capabilities that communications providers may have. But then they also introduced what's known as a technical capability notice. And this is really the kind of, I think, one of the main points, or one of the more interesting aspects of this law. They use the same language as what we see in the Investigatory Powers Act, but they actually differ quite significantly. So the TCNs authorise the Attorney General, again it's an executive position, not a judicial position, to issue a technical capability notice that is directed towards ensuring that a provider is capable of giving certain types of help to ASIO, which is our security intelligence organisation, or an interception agency. So this is key. These TCNs underpin the development of new capabilities for the purposes of issuing the technical assistance requests and notices. So they basically are asking telecommunications or designated communications providers to build new ways, an unlimited range of new ways to collect information. So it means that providers may be required to develop unknown new ways for law enforcement to collect information. There are some limitations because of the public debate around this, around introducing systemic weaknesses or backdoors. But what exactly this means, or what precisely a backdoor is, has been very much hotly contested, and in particular in the lead up to this debate. So these are the limitations that they're introducing in relation to what constitutes or an introduction of a systemic weakness or vulnerability or backdoor. So in terms of public discourse in the Australian debate on this issue, there was much focus on the limits to implementing or building a backdoor or building weaknesses into communication systems. This again was very unpalatable politically in terms of creating weaknesses in the critical digital infrastructure that other nefarious actors could exploit. So they introduced some of these constraints in relation to what they could or couldn't do around a backdoor. The question remains, and I think it is still open, well, what does this actually mean? This is the kind of the existential question of what actually constitutes a backdoor in both a very strict technical but also a very strict legal sense. And so I think it's here that the intersections of law and technology become very interesting. And I think what this is starting to show, or some of these limits around not implementing kind of systemic weaknesses or a systemic weakness, or the fact that they're putting these kind of limits in the legislation, is starting to show that, well, I think they realise that the laws of mathematics actually do apply in this context, whether or not they may not like to believe that, or they might not like to admit that publicly. So I think that there's a lot of questions and unresolved ones about this. And I think you can argue either way, actually. What does a systemic weakness or a systemic vulnerability really mean? So in their submission to the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, Cisco stated that what they define a backdoor is any surveillance capability that is intentionally introduced and yet not transparently disclosed. And I think that's a pretty good definition of a backdoor, actually, and it may not be one in a very strict technical sense, but I think in terms of when we start to think about, well, what the impact of this is in kind of a legal or a policy sense, in terms of what they're doing, that's kind of an interesting one. I think when we think about this at network level, that kind of applies when we consider the types of acts or things that this law is authorising, and I'm listing them on the slide. So this is taken kind of from the legislation. So removing one or more forms of electronic protection, providing technical information, installing, maintaining, testing or using software or equipment, assisting with testing, modification, development, maintenance. So this is around things like updates, inserting malicious code into updates, for example, failing to patch vulnerabilities in software, for example, substituting or facilitating the substitution of a service provided by the designated communications provider, or anything done to conceal the fact that anything has been done. So I think that this is incredibly broad, and they are in effect creating a systemic weakness at network level by doing these types of acts or things. But whether it's not an encryption backdoor in the technical sense, I think you're the best people to answer that. So if we go with Cisco's definition, perhaps, but from kind of the cryptographic position, perhaps not. And I think, this exploiting existing vulnerabilities and also stockpiling software vulnerabilities or failing to patch them to facilitate law enforcement access is where we're really going next in this debate. So I think it's actually less about encryption per se in a strict sense, and rather gaining access to one's keyboard, for example, and sending everything someone types on their keyboard back. Other kind of, not so much a backdoor, but a side door, perhaps. All right, so another point that I just wanted to touch on briefly is issues of extraterritoriality. Again, a very much a central focus of my research. I think it's also been overlooked in public discourse, and also when I travel internationally and talk to people overseas or people who may be affected by this law but do not know. These powers, they apply extraterritorially, they facilitate the transnational information exchange, and they also do so outside of traditional mutual legal assistance treaty or MLAT processes, which is the kind of formal legal structures and agreements that states have in place to ensure that the due process rights of suspects are upheld in kind of transnational investigations. Another analysis that I also want to conduct, but I have not had a chance to start it yet, is to see how these provisions align with the Council of Europe Convention on Cybercrime, so the Budapest Convention, and I actually have an honours student who will commence working on that this year. So police complain all the time. We know this is the case. MLAT processes are incredibly cumbersome. They take a lot of time, but I would argue they're very important for upholding due process rights of suspects, and also the prevention of kind of unbridled transnational surveillance. And I think this is really significant, particularly already in the context of Five Eyes, very well-known information sharing to circumvent domestic limits and jurisdiction shop. So there are two kind of dimensions here in terms of the extraterritoriality that this law introduces. The first is the transnational enforcement of designated communications providers. Again, how this will be enforced remains an open question. And the second is amendments to the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Act under the Schedule 2 part of the legislation that allows for Australian law enforcement agencies to undertake lawful hacking, so to conduct computer network operations on behalf of, or arrange access to information on behalf of foreign jurisdictions. And also in the course of provisions around technical assistance requests and notices, and technical capability notices also apply in relation to the enforcement of foreign laws. So for example, our Attorney General can issue a technical capability notice to Facebook to design new ways to collect information for the investigation of an offence in America, and an offence in America involving the death penalty, which we don't have. And then that information is then able to be kind of funneled back through Australia as the weak link, because we have an absence of enforceable human rights protections. So you see how this is starting to work? It's pretty sneaky. All right, so in terms of some of the issues and concerns that I have, there are many. There are a range of issues with this new law. I've listed some of them here. I guess we can discuss these kind of ad nauseum. These are the main ones that I have, particularly given that this new system that they're introducing will operate in almost complete secrecy. And there's also imprisonment for unauthorised disclosure. There is some scope for disclosing very high-level statistics about what's going on, about the number of notices issued in a 6-month period, but they cannot be disaggregated by agency or indeed any other way. And you can't disclose the existence of one of these or the non-existence, so they also rule out warrant canaries as well. I think the incredibly broad application is frightening. It includes obvious entities, like carriages or carriage service providers, so for example telcos, but it also includes other broader categories. So there's, in the legislation as passed, there's a 3-page table listing pretty much everyone that this applies to. So for example, it covers a person, and I'm quoting here, that provides an electronic service that has one or more end users in Australia. That appears to cover every website that is accessible from Australia. Furthermore, the legislation also covers an individual if, and I'm quoting again, the person develops, supplies or updates software used, for use or likely to be used in connection with a listed carriage service or an electronic carriage service that has one or more end users in Australia. That appears, from my perspective, to apply to every piece of software or mobile app that connects to the internet or produces content that is going to be used on the internet where possibly someone from Australia can access it. So it's a very broad application in terms of some of these categories. And again, from a kind of a legal perspective, when we kind of evaluate whether or not this is proportional or necessary, I don't think justification for this very broad application is clear. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff. But I think that the almost in near secrecy operation and then also very broad application are kind of the key messages. Again, in terms of this assessment that we make about whether or not these new powers are necessary and proportionate, I think that we should view them alongside the extensive existing powers and capabilities that law enforcement and intelligence agencies already have, which some of them are already really bad, like compelling people to provide their passwords, for example, and that they're being strengthened and or expanded by this law, by the Us Access law. So it's also worth noting that other Five Eyes partners also have some of these powers as well. The UK, for example, has powers to authorise equipment interference. The US has also recently amended Rule 41 of criminal procedure that enables the FVEY to conduct network investigative techniques extraterritorially and hack into computers all over the world, authorised solely by a US domestic judge. So there's a lot going on here. And in terms of some of the computer network operation stuff that is strengthened by Schedule 2 of the Act, I mean, this obviously requires access to vulnerabilities, to be able to hack devices, and there are arguments, again, against government stockpiling vulnerabilities, stockpiling software vulnerabilities, as opposed to disclosure so they can be patched. And the disclosure and management of software vulnerabilities is actually a really interesting developing area of regulation internationally, actually, something that I want to work on more into the future. But I'm sure you're way more aware of the potential consequences of this than I am. And, you know, I just cast my mind back to WannaCry, for example, that took down the NHS. There are also a whole range of other powers and capabilities outside of lawful hacking also. They already have the capability, powers to compel individuals to provide their passwords. I think that is going to become really interesting in the context of biometrics, whether or not you can force someone to provide access via their fingerprint or via their face, as so many of our devices now are secured by biometric information. And also there's a whole wide range of commercial hacking tools, in particular that provided by Israeli company Celebrite, for example, which played a key role in the cracking or brute force attack on the encrypted iPhone in Apple FVEY. They also have powers for preventative detention, so to lock people up if they suspect them of doing something or being a terrorist, for example, and to put them in a star chamber and hold coercive hearings. And so if they don't answer questions, they're essentially detained. So there's a whole bunch of other stuff. So I really think these arguments that we desperately need these new powers to be able to fight organised crime and terrorism are overstated. So what? Alright, well, what can we take away from this? I know that's a lot of information and about a foreign legal jurisdiction that I'm throwing at you. So what is the kind of take-home message? And also in the context of the wider Five Eyes partnership. So whether or not this does constitute a backdoor, that is debatable. Perhaps we can have this debate. It comes down to semantics, I think. But actually what I think is important about this and what it represents is kind of attempts to compel designated communication providers to developing new ways of collecting information, and then also a kind of expansion of powers to access endpoints when information is not encrypted. And in the Australian context, this is super important. We only have primary legislation to ensure that these types of surveillance measures are proportionate and necessary. And this also applies to issues of lawful hacking. So for example, in this law, it's the executive, the Attorney General, Director General of Security, or the Chief of an interception agency making an assessment of what is necessary and proportionate, and that is super problematic. Coops and Costa have also argued when they're in their article around whether or not there'll be Crypto War 3.0, they kind of argue, well, you know, legal hacking powers, in the event or if human rights standards are sufficiently taken into account, could be the only realistic policy option to preserve some light in an era of dark communication channels. And that's why they argue there will be no Crypto War 3.0. And look, I think that's a really important point. And we also need to examine the exact conditions under which this type of exceptional access, whether that be kind of via these new powers or via lawful hacking, is justified. Or at least we need to have some channels to be able to do so. So for example, judicial kind of oversight, testing these kind of cases in a courtroom. Again, the outcomes of what we're seeing here in terms of this new law will be completely hidden from public view, so we won't be able to know. Local context, again, is really important. Australia is the weak link in the Five Eyes Alliance because we don't have any comprehensive or enforceable protection of human rights. This enables the introduction of new laws, as I've outlined today, and new law enforcement powers that are not permissible in other jurisdictions that have stronger human rights protections. So, for example, we also have mandatory metadata retention as well, just despite some of the kind of rulings of the European Court of Justice and European Court of Human Rights and the what was it? Digital Rights Island case that kind of threw that out in the EU. Anyway, so in terms of these type of intrusive and exceptional powers, it is absolutely crucial that they're overseen independently and that the public can be assured that these types of incursions or intrusions into their private life are indeed necessary and proportionate. But this, again, avenues for doing so is completely lacking in the Australian context. In terms of the global implications of this and how it may affect people in this room, I think it's possible that once a solution, inverted commas, and perhaps a technical solution is developed and introduced in the Australian domestic legal framework, there's more scope for transfer and mobility, irrespective with how those perhaps technical solutions align with local legal frameworks. And so I think that process, in concert with coordination with technology companies, especially the big ones, may lead to this introduction of new mobile technical solutions in Australia that subsequently travel and have global impacts, which I think is pertinent to consider when we think about the extraterritorial applications of these laws, both as they apply offshore to designated communications providers, very broadly defined, but also the enforcement of foreign laws through the sovereign state of Australia. And also, it's important, I think, also to outline again from kind of a legal perspective, while telecommunications information that is obtained through these kind of back channels, through this kind of sneakiness, It may not be able to be admitted in the context of a criminal trial and secure prosecution, and therefore kind of withstand this kind of necessary fundamental rights and constitutional scrutiny. It nevertheless may feed into a much wider intelligence apparatus, and that's kind of where we're going, is this kind of mass collection of information about people. So, on that note, I just wanted to thank you, I guess, for your attention today. I know that I perhaps went a bit over, and I heard you've already been subject to kind of another really long presentation earlier. But I'm keen to continue to discuss this, and also kind of some of the kind of factors and conflicts within other approaches that we see in the EU, so particularly principles around data protection by design and default, whereas I see this as kind of an attempt to undermine or weaken information security by design and default.